Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 17 of Series 7. The question for today is, does belief in intrinsic value indicate a radical misunderstanding of value? Reading, for those who want it, from one of my works, The Pursuit of Value, Chapter 2, Section 9. So my overall objective is to grasp human existence as consciousness and resolve its problems in terms of value. This has involved explicating value as well as offering solutions in terms of a sufficiency of value. And I have previously presented numerous methods and characteristics of value in order to explain value. These included features like subjectivity or objectivity and object involvement, as well as features like preference, quality, affect, graduation and intentionality. Some examples of value are desire, love, hate, morality, aesthetics and bias, as well as truth and beauty. These illustrate the problem of the diversity of values that different states may be masquerading as the concept of value. But today I want to discuss a problem concerning another standard way of defining value or values. This is whether values are intrinsic values or are instrumental or attributed values. My question isn't primarily about the adequacy of these criteria themselves. It's about whether the property of intrinsic value is being correctly conferred. Briefly, John Mackey and others argue that there are no objective values, in which he includes intrinsic values. Objectivity here means ontologically substantive entities in the world, not normativity or universality. And I agree that only mental states and conscious beings or people are candidates of intrinsic value. That is, in my view, value is something that has to reside in minds or mental states like wanting or liking. This is because objective entities can't have the subjective properties that value must have. These would be disparate kinds of things, like numbers can't have the properties of colour. And to regard values as having intrinsic value requires a further qualification. That is, a qualification like coherence, organic unity, or always being of value. Yet the belief in the intrinsic value of certain principles, actions or objects is held by many prominent philosophers. These include G.E. Moore, Ronald Dworkin and Derek Parfit. This is unexpected considering the arguments against this view. Does this mean that the arguments against the possibility of the intrinsic value of material objects are flawed, or does it mean that we have discovered a widespread error in the value theory that has gone unnoticed? And could this be compared to Hume's discovery of widespread and fallacious derivations of morals from facts? G.E. Moore similarly claimed to find the naturalistic fallacy in practically every previous moral theory. The significance of such an error in the case of intrinsic value indicates a widespread misunderstanding of value, and that such a misunderstanding will have repercussions on value as a solution to human problems. We must therefore define intrinsic values, usually in contrast to instrumental or attributed values. Instrumental values are attributed with value as a means towards some other end. Intrinsic values are valuable due to their own inherent qualities, not qualities attributed to them. We must also consider different ways in which these values are considered to be intrinsic. Money is accepted as tokens without intrinsic value. Valuables like gold are thought to have intrinsic value, but only in an economic context. Valuables are valuable for what they appropriate, like houses or cars. But physical objects are only valuable for the satisfactions they bring. So on this view, ultimately, only mental states and conscious beings can have intrinsic value. Conversely, truth, beauty and knowledge are properties that are traditional candidates of intrinsic value. William Frankenna names a long list of intrinsic values, including activity, strength and novelty. I provide an almost full list of Frankenna's intrinsic values in my notes below. But the extent of Frankenna's list is almost self-refuting, because it undermines any specific meaning of intrinsic value. Yet all these examples raise the question that is central to this discussion. That is, in addition to material objects, can abstract properties or principles have intrinsic value? One consideration in this question is to note the significance of context of supposed intrinsic values. For example, valuables like diamonds are widely accepted as only having intrinsic value in an economic context. Truth, beauty and knowledge also might be thought as having a human context that can't be escaped. But their intrinsic value should reside in themselves regardless of context, which is in question. And that is part of the argument that we must now consider. Mackie's case against objective values is central to that of the intrinsic value of objects, properties and principles. John Mackie boldly states that there are no objective values and, importantly, in the fabric of the world. This allows exceptions for mental states and minds that objectivity doesn't include normativity. Yet relevant here is that Mackie's rejection of objective values includes intrinsic values. He writes that something or other is intrinsically valuable, objectively good, has been undermined by the rejection of all objective values, unquote. Mackie gives three arguments against the idea of objective values. In my view, two of these are largely psychological. Firstly, that the direction of dependence is mistakenly reversed by making the desire depend upon the goodness. We can again note that Mackie includes something having intrinsic value in this reversal. Yet the point is that the value of an object mistakenly depends on our belief that it is valuable, rather than the value of the object promoting our belief that it is valuable. And secondly, Mackie points to the psychological propensity of the mind to spread itself on external objects. Such has also been noted by Hume, Freud and others, otherwise known as psychological projection. Mackie describes his third argument against objective values as an argument from queerness. That is, objective values would have a very queer or untenable quasi-objective status, and that apprehension of knowledge of such entities would be problematic. He writes that if there were objective values, then they would be entities or qualities or relations of a very strange sort, utterly different from anything else in the universe. On Mackie's argument from queerness, objective values would be anomalous. I agree, because values like wanting and liking cannot exist independently of a conscious mind. and also because physical objects or abstract principles can't have subjective properties like values. They are disparate kinds of things, like numbers can't have the properties of colour. And in my view, even beauty and truth can't exist independently of a conscious mind. Yet Anthony Grayling rejects Mackie's argument from queerness because he says there are many things that appear queer on first encounter because we are not familiar with them. This may be so, but they aren't queer in the way that Mackie specifies as above. But many philosophers like Frank Kenner above, or G.E. Moore, Ronald Dworkin and Derek Parfit believe in intrinsic values, and these thinkers hold objectivist ethical views that are supported by this belief in intrinsic values. Frank Kenner is a Christian whose ethical objectivism and intrinsic values are bolstered by religion. Yet for all of them, the idea of certain principles having intrinsic value is presuppositional to their objectivism, and their objectivism significantly rests on an admittedly intuitive basis. And this intuitive basis is underpinned by the presupposition of widespread intrinsic values. I want to undermine this objectivist intuition by revealing the falsity of their intrinsic values. Truth and beauty, such as works of art, have also been traditionally regarded as having intrinsic value. And although G.E. Moore opposes this view, he is strangely ambivalent on the issue of intrinsic value. To start with, Moore holds that things intrinsically good or bad are many and various, and these would include abstract principles and material objects. Yet he qualifies which of these can have intrinsic value. That is, on Moore's view, they are of intrinsic value because they are organic unities. And he adds another condition of intrinsic value, that it must reside in human consciousness. He writes that to be conscious of a beautiful object is a thing of great intrinsic value, whereas the same object, if no one be conscious of it, has certainly comparatively little value and is commonly held to have none at all. Yet he is ambivalent when considering the value of beauty in the absence of human consciousness. Moore is ambivalent because he considers an object having little or no value if no one is conscious of it. And in considering the value of possible worlds in the absence of consciousness, he holds that it is better that the beautiful world should exist than one which is ugly. So Moore is making a judgment on the basis of the intrinsic value of these worlds, and that judgment of intrinsic value is made in the absence of consciousness. Moore's wider concerns are that the moral good can't be defined, is unanalysable, and intrinsic values are organic unities. Yet on his view of the intrinsic value of objects is clouded by his contradictory objective preference for beauty, which must be apprehended by consciousness. Putting his view in this way, it does seem contradictory. But this is my point concerning the ambiguity about intrinsic value. Moore holds that the moral good is unanalysable, yet he believes that it can be apprehended intuitively, and he rather unsatisfactorily explains the material content of the good in terms of consequences. Ronald Dworkin is more definitive in claiming moral facts like torturing babies for fun is wrong in itself. Most of us would agree that torturing babies is wrong, but some would disagree about why it is wrong. but Dworkin insists that such moral facts or values exist independently of the mind. And he confirms this view by saying that paintings and great trees can have intrinsic value. That is, in his view, objects, actions, or their principles can have intrinsic value. So I am challenging all three aspects of this view. Yet Dworkin's method for finding moral facts is an interpretation of the best account of value that we can find. And Dworkin expects that best account will arrive at one objectively true account. That is, on this view, there must be that is one right answer about the best thing to do. This seems preposterous, yet he supports this view with what he calls the ordinary view. That is, the common intuition that certain actions like torture are wrong in themselves. I have previously outlined arguments against Dworkin's definitive conclusions from his interpretive methods. My point here is rather to bring attention to his claims of moral facts and intrinsically right or wrong actions, and that these claims are ultimately based on intuitions that are here in question. Yet of course, beliefs shouldn't be overturned simply because they are based on intuitions. Many intuitions are well founded and are unavoidable because they are the first principles of a system. Such include 1 + 1 = 2, which may or may not have been proven by Russell, Whitehead and Quine, or that other people are really conscious and not automatons, or that the good will is really good. Intuition is an essential capacity that nevertheless can be very unreliable and misleading, especially when supporting long-standing presuppositions that defy both reason and knowledge. This is the case with intuitive justification of intrinsic values or right or wrong. The work of Derek Parfit can be criticised in a similar way to that of Dworkin's, but instead of agreed interpretation, Parfit grounds his objectivism on irreducible normative truths. He gives mathematics, logic, and the fact that we have reason as examples of normative truth. In his in-sense experience, he gives the example of normative truth as it is bad to be in pain. But it's contentious that it is always bad to be in pain, and it is thereby a flawed example of normative truth in the human world. Many would challenge it, including Nietzscheans, athletes, masochists and superheroes. And again, we find that Parfit's idea of normative truth is an intuitive presupposition. He further supposes, with little argument, that normative truth can ground ethical truth. And we can also note that he significantly never uses the term normative moral truth. Yet Parfit's underlying aspiration isn't just moral truth, but is implied in the title of his work, On What Matters. And what matters, in Parfit's view, depends upon the existence of objective moral values. That is, we have reasons to care about things for their own sake, not just because of their satisfactions. But his view isn't Platonistic in the sense of making claims about otherworldly realms. He appeals instead to the intrinsic value of irreducibly normative truth. Parfit's irreducibly normative truths lead to objective moral values that are given the status of intrinsic values. He claims that things like books and rational activity can have intrinsic value which confirms his view. Parfit does include people in the things that can have intrinsic value, but I hold that only people and certain mental states can have intrinsic value. Parfit's claims are crucial for him because, on his objectivist view, legitimate reasons for action are only given by the intrinsic features of what we might want. But conversely, he claims that on subjective theories we have no such object-given reasons. Yet I hold that there can be intrinsic features of values of subjective states, that is, of certain value states. So I disagree that there is a need to ground these in mind-independent intrinsic values and truths. And I find it lacking in perception and imagination to have to care about these things for their own sake. In my view, caring about things for their own sake seems psychologically contradictory, but arguments for these views are either above or have been made elsewhere, and they are particularly illuminating with reference to truth and beauty. We have mentioned problems with intrinsic value of beauty, but truth is a stronger candidate. To begin with, truth makes inescapable claims on human beings that it seems we ought to take up. We must also presuppose truth in every inquiry, and to deny truth is self-contradictory, and such a denial of truth also might well undermine our self-value in lying to ourselves. In this sense, we ought to pursue or affirm the truth as a seemingly intrinsic value, and the truth comes closest to something that Parfit thinks we should care about for its own sake. But what is it that motivates us to affirm or will the truth? Is it the sheer conception of the truth alone, or is it the value that we seek in pursuing the truth? In my view, the truth is lit up by the values that motivate us to seek it, such as self-value and the pursuit of objectivity. The nature of truth is, in fact, contingent, undermining its status as an objective or intrinsic value. Truth is an anthropocentric concept, constructed by human beings, not bestowed by God. Even Kant spoke of truth as only a regulative principle. G.E. Moore, Russell and Freud argued, and Alfred Tarski is said to have proved, that truth is undefinable. And as we have seen, there is no definitive theory of truth or final content of any particular truth. This contingency is underlined by Nietzsche's adage that the truth is ugly. Yet Bernard Williams holds that ethics needs an unconditional will to truth, and he accepts the intrinsic value of truthfulness, but not that truth has intrinsic value. This can be explained because truthfulness, but not truth, is a mental state or attitude, and the fact that truthfulness is a mental state makes it a viable candidate of intrinsic value. But abstract principles like truth cannot have intrinsic value because they lack the subjectivity of value, and unlike attitudes such as truthfulness and the will to truth, the concept of truth is an abstract principle. The concept of truth is a cognitive state, but values are excluded from cognition due to the fact-value distinction. Facts may be value-laden or have value entanglement, but value is excluded from fact purely as a fact. These considerations indicate that truth, unlike moral or value states, cannot have intrinsic value. Underlining this view, even Kant said that nothing can be conceived in the world which can be called good, except a good will. This indicates Kant's view that only a moral will can be of intrinsic moral value. So I will proceed on the view that intrinsic value can only be erroneously attributed to actions, principles and objects. So does this mean that we have discovered a widespread error in value theory that has gone unnoticed? Partly in answer to this question, we should now consider some consequences of this view. Yet I first want to consider another kind of phenomenon that is also falsely regarded as having intrinsic value, that is happiness. John Stuart Mill argued that we know that happiness is uniquely valuable. Mill argued that happiness is uniquely valuable because it's the only thing we desire for its own sake. I disagree that happiness is uniquely valuable and it's not the only thing we desire for its own sake. I've previously listed many value states that are desirable for their own sake, like self-esteem and love. Moreover, and more to the point, happiness can't be an intrinsically valuable state because it's not always valuable. And we can add that happiness fails as an ethical criterion because it lacks purpose, value and the why of life. But it's certainly desirable to be happy, and happiness is an undeniable human good. More than that, happiness has a certain sufficiency in itself. That is, its sufficiency means that nothing more is needed to endorse the experience of happiness. So experiences of happiness can be intrinsically happy, and some experiences can be intrinsically valuable, but the experience of happiness itself isn't intrinsically valuable. Next, consider the uncontentious ethical view that natural disasters cannot be considered to be morally wrong. For example, terrible actions of wild animals cannot be considered to be wrong in a moral sense. And similarly, actions of demented humans cannot be considered to be unethical. My point is that moral content can only be attributed to subjective intention, and this view is supported by Kant's view that only a good will can be legitimately called good. Taking this view further, the implication is that actions cannot be moral in themselves. So acts of murder, rape and theft would not be objectively or intrinsically immoral. On this view, it is the human intent that makes them moral or immoral. Or Shakespeare's Hamlet says, there is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. But of course, such actions might be wrong in the sense of being unwanted or undesirable events. They might be wrong in this sense, but not wrong in themselves in a strict moral sense. But actions like theft are often regarded as intrinsically wrong. Yet this is because the idea of wrongness is inextricably included in the meaning of such terms. Like truth and ethical action, the concept of justice could also not be regarded as having intrinsic value. This view is endorsed by the idea of justice as a relative, subjective or social value. That is, an objective or strict notion of justice has long thought to need tempering with mercy, compassion or forgiveness. And punitive justice has more recently been regarded as a way of masking a psychological need for revenge. Yet such psychological observations stand in need of philosophical argument. Also, as a challenge to objective and intrinsic value, justice invariably involves relations between people. Aristotle, for example, noted that as a complete virtue, justice was always in relation to another person. And John Rawls also described justice as the first virtue of social institutions. These comments suggest that justice is a social relation or a social convention without an independent existence. Hume endorses this view of justice as a human invention, but not one to be easily dispensed with. Yet he also believes that justice has no place in close personal relations such as the family. It would also be a mistake to speak of the meaning of life, manifest destiny, human purpose residing in the physical world, or any fixed meaning of the notion of enlightenment. Justice is, however, thought to be grounded on the relatively new idea of rights or human rights. But the idea of rights also presupposes intrinsic value and is similarly challenged. Jeremy Bentham, for example, describes natural rights as nonsense upon stilts, and Peter Singer described the notion of rights as a convenient political shorthand. And in my view, rights are objectified human wants. That is, rights may be highly desirable and indeed good and right, but these rights or wants must be justified in some other way, that is, other than their objectification as intrinsic values. As part of my conclusion, I can reiterate my wider view not explicitly argued above. That is, ethics isn't an adequate category or method for understanding the human condition. And part of that argument is against the objectivist views of ethics considered above. But today, my criticism of objectivist ethics has been against its underlying presupposition of intrinsic values, and that both objectivist ethics and intrinsic values are grounded in mistaken and misleading intuitions. John Mackey provided an argument that there were no objective values which included intrinsic values. That argument was against the intrinsic value of actions, principles, objects, and even some experiences. My view, supported above, is that only minds and mental states are viable candidates of intrinsic value, and these are only of intrinsic value when they involve affirmative reflexive values. For example, again, self-esteem, magnanimity, or moral fortitude. The consequences of rejecting certain intrinsic values not only held against objectivist ethics, but also against the viability of a range of traditional concepts. These included the intrinsic value of happiness, truth, justice, and rights, as well as any irreducible normative truths. Are those arguments against certain, and indeed most, intrinsic values valid? And if they are valid, have we discovered a common error in value theory that has gone unnoticed? These questions can only be answered on the widespread consideration by other philosophers. So let me have your criticism and comments at the meeting or on websites like YouTube or meetup.com.